Good afternoon or good morning, whatever it is in your part of the world. My name is Andrew Moxon and welcome to Moxie's channel of English language, number 13. And today we will be boiling some water in the kettle. Okay. That's boiling water. It's a bit hard for me to draw on. I'm not the best drawer. That's a kettle. That's boiling the water in the kettle. It all makes sense after you've done a few of my videos. And it might scare you a bit. Okay, let's do it. I'm not going to read through these. I'll put them in the text section of the video itself, so you can see it. But we will do a lot of them here. Okay. Oh, by the way, I almost forgot. If you'd like to contribute to this channel, you can with my PayPal account at moxiecell@gmail.com, and that is moxycel@gmail.com, and you could also see that text in the text section of the YouTube channel. Thank you. So here we go. Past tense. Okay. I always make it the same so you don't have to think. All you have to do is train. Train, train, train. Do not practice until you get it right. You train until you never get it wrong. Do you understand? That's professionals. The professional does that. The amateur practices until they get it right. The professional trains until they never get it wrong. Not guaranteed for everyone. Okay. Past tense, right. I have boiled some water in the kettle. I have not boiled some water in the kettle. I've boiled some water in the kettle. I haven't boiled some water in the kettle. Here we go. I've boiled some water in the kettle. I haven't boiled some water in the kettle. Kettle. Okay, present tense. I am boiling some water in the kettle. I am not boiling some water in the kettle. I'm boiling some water in the kettle. I'm not boiling some water in the kettle. I'm boiling some water in the kettle. I'm not boiling some water in the kettle. I am going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I am not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I'm going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I'm not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I'm going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I'm not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. I will boil some water in the kettle. I will not boil some water in the kettle. I'll boil some water in the kettle. I won't boil some water in the kettle. It's you. Past tense. Away we go. You have boiled some water in the kettle. You have not boiled some water in the kettle. You've boiled some water in the kettle. You haven't boiled some water in the kettle. You've boiled some water in the kettle. You haven't boiled some water in the kettle. Present tense. You are boiling some water in the kettle. You are not boiling some water in the kettle. You're boiling some water in the kettle. You're not boiling some water in the kettle. You're boiling some water in the kettle. You're not boiling some water in the kettle. Future tense. You are going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You are not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. You will boil some water in the kettle. You will not boil some water in the kettle. You'll boil some water in the kettle. You won't boil some water in the kettle. So you'll, you will, you'll. It's a strange sound, isn't it? He or she. He has boiled some water in the kettle. She has not boiled some water in the kettle. He's boiled some water in the kettle. She hasn't boiled some water in the kettle. She's boiled some water in the kettle. He hasn't boiled some water in the kettle. He hasn't. Present tense. She is boiling some water in the kettle. He is not boiling some water in the kettle. She's boiling some water in the kettle. He hasn't boiled some water in the kettle. He's boiled some water in the kettle. She hasn't boiled some water in the kettle. Did I do that right? No. He's boiling some water in the kettle. She hasn't boiled some... Sorry, no. Sorry about that. He's boiling some water in the kettle. She's not boiling some water in the kettle. That's what I meant. That's present tense. I get very confused sometimes. You can understand why I do these all day. So, I won't go over it again. Future. He is going to be boiling some water in the kettle. She is not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. He's going to be boiling some water in the kettle. She's not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. He's going to be boiling some water in the kettle. She's not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. The kettle. He will boil some water in the kettle. She will not boil some water in the kettle. He'll boil some water in the kettle. She won't boil some water in the kettle. We have boiled some water in the kettle. We have not boiled some water in the kettle. We've boiled some water in the kettle. We haven't boiled some water in the kettle. We've boiled some water in the kettle. We haven't boiled some water in the kettle. Present tense. We are boiling some water in the kettle. We are not boiling some water in the kettle. We're boiling some water in the kettle. We're not boiling some water in the kettle. We're boiling some water in the kettle. We're not boiling some water in the kettle. Okay. Future. We are going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We are not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. We will boil some water in the kettle. We will not boil some water in the kettle. We'll boil some water in the kettle. We won't boil some water in the kettle. They, past tense, they have boiled some water in the kettle. They have not boiled some water in the kettle. They've boiled some water in the kettle. They haven't boiled some water in the kettle. They've boiled some water in the kettle. They haven't boiled some water in the kettle. Present tense. They are boiling some water in the kettle. They are not boiling some water in the kettle. They're not boiling some water in the kettle. Sorry, they're not boiling some water in the kettle. Getting a bit confused here. They're boiling some water in the kettle. They're not boiling some water in the kettle. Sometimes I forget where I am. And kind of sound the same after a while. Future tense. They are going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They are not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They're going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They're not going to be boiling some water in the kettle. They will boil some water in the kettle. They will not boil some water in the kettle. They'll boil some water in the kettle. They won't boil some water in the kettle. Well, that's the end of this one. I thought that was pretty good. Sometimes I get confused. Well, I suppose it's understandable. There's so many of them and they sound very similar. But just keep on going. Remember, 5 times. Remember, 5 times. Do these 5 times and do not practice until you get them right. You train until you never get it wrong. Not guaranteed for everyone. Don't work hard, work smart. Good one.